So let's start. 1,000 years ago, doctors had no lab coats, no antibiotics, no MRI machines, and yet some of what they did actually saved lives. Here's the proof. Number 1. Long before a single white tablet existed, medieval healers were stripping bark from willow trees and brewing it into a bitter tea. Patients with fevers, joint pain, and headaches drank it down, and it worked. Not because of magic, not because of superstition, but because willow bark contains salicin, the natural compound that modern chemistry eventually refined into aspirin. We didn't invent aspirin. We rediscovered it. Think about what this means for a moment. A village healer in 11th century England had no access to universities, no peer-reviewed journals, no chemistry labs. What they had was centuries of careful, passed-down observation. They noticed that people who drank willow bark tea felt better. They noted which trees, which seasons, which preparations worked best. This was empirical science conducted entirely through lived experience. And the applications were remarkably sophisticated. Some healers combined willow bark with meadowsweet, another salicin-rich plant, to intensify the effect. Others used it topically for inflamed wounds. The dosing wasn't precise by modern standards, but it wasn't random either. Experienced practitioners learned through practice what amount brought relief without causing harm. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When we dismiss ancient medicine as pure ignorance, we're ignoring the reality that these people were running a 1,000-year clinical trial. The treatments that killed patients were quietly abandoned. The ones that helped were kept, refined, and passed down. Willow bark survived that brutal filter because it genuinely worked. The body doesn't lie. If the fever broke, the treatment stayed in circulation. Modern pharmaceutical companies have spent billions synthesizing molecules that mimic what this tree produces for free. That's not a coincidence. That's confirmation. Number 2. Honey. Medieval physicians spread it on infected wounds, packed it into surgical incisions, and used it to dress burns. For centuries, modern medicine rolled its eyes at this. It sounded like folk remedy nonsense, sweet, sticky, and obviously useless against serious bacterial infection. Then researchers looked more carefully, and the eye-rolling stopped. Honey is genuinely antibacterial. Multiple mechanisms explain why. Its low moisture content dehydrates bacteria at the cellular level. Its high sugar concentration creates osmotic pressure that pulls fluid out of microbial cells, essentially collapsing them. It produces hydrogen peroxide slowly and steadily, a natural antiseptic. And certain honeys, particularly those from specific flowering plants, contain additional antimicrobial compounds that resist bacterial enzymes. Medieval wound treatment often outperformed alternatives of the era precisely because of honey. Wounds packed with honey stayed cleaner, developed less putrefaction, and healed with less scarring than wounds left open or treated with other substances. Battlefield surgeons, men who saw thousands of wounds, consistently reached for honey. That preference wasn't superstition. That was pattern recognition from the front lines of traumatic medicine. What's remarkable is the sophistication of application. Ancient practitioners understood that different honeys behaved differently. Honey from certain mountain regions was prized above others. Some healers mixed honey with specific herb extracts to enhance the effect. They were, unknowingly, doing something that modern pharmacologists call synergistic formulation, combining agents whose combined effect exceeds the sum of their parts. Today, medical-grade Manuka honey is used in certified clinical wound dressings. Hospitals use it on chronic ulcers, post-surgical infections, and burns. The ancient healers would not be surprised. They simply would have said, "We already knew this." Number 3. Here is where it gets genuinely disturbing and genuinely impressive. Trepanation is the practice of drilling or scraping a hole through the human skull while the patient is alive. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures in documented human history, and a significant percentage of patients survived it. We know they survived because archaeological evidence is unambiguous. Skulls recovered from medieval and ancient sites show trepanation holes with clear bone regrowth around the edges. Bone doesn't regrow after death. If the margin shows healing, the person lived for months or years after the procedure. Some skulls show multiple trepanations. The same individual underwent the operation more than once and survived each time. The conditions being treated included skull fractures from combat, severe headaches potentially caused by intracranial pressure, epilepsy, and certain behavioral disturbances that practitioners of the time attributed to trapped spirits, but which may have had genuine neurological causes. In the case of depressed skull fractures, where broken bone presses inward against the brain, trepanation is still the correct treatment. Medieval surgeons didn't know why it worked, but they had observed that lifting the bone fragment out often produced dramatic improvement, so they kept doing it. The tools were simple: flint, obsidian, later iron. The technique required precise knowledge of skull anatomy, where to drill, at what angle, how deep to go without penetrating the dura mater beneath. This knowledge was clearly transmissible, because the survival rates across different sites and eras are consistently higher than chance would predict. It's easy to look at a skull with a hole in it and feel revulsion. It's harder, and more honest, to look at the healed edges around that hole and feel something closer to respect. Number 4. Medieval field surgeons noticed something disturbing and fascinating. Soldiers whose wounds had become infested with maggots often recovered better than soldiers whose wounds had not. The wounds were cleaner. The tissue around them was healthier. The infection retreated. This observation was documented repeatedly across different conflicts, different cultures, different centuries. What was actually happening is now well understood. Certain fly larvae consume only necrotic, dead, tissue. They do not eat living healthy cells. They chemically break down dead flesh, consuming it and eliminating it from the wound. Simultaneously, they secrete compounds that actively inhibit bacterial growth, including bacteria that modern antibiotics struggle against. The wound, in effect, was being cleaned from the inside by a biological system perfectly evolved for exactly that task. Medieval practitioners who deliberately introduced maggots into gangrenous wounds were practicing what we now call maggot debridement therapy. It sounds medieval in the worst sense of the word, except that it is also contemporary, licensed, regulated, and actively used in modern hospitals to treat wounds that resist all other approaches. Diabetic foot ulcers, pressure sores, post-surgical infections. In cases where standard treatment has failed, maggot therapy succeeds with documented regularity. The philosophical point here is crucial. These healers were not operating blind. They were watching outcomes and adjusting behavior accordingly. When a treatment produced better results, they used it again. They couldn't explain the mechanism. No one could until microbiology existed, but they trusted the evidence their eyes provided. That is the foundation of empirical medicine, dressed in rough linen and candlelight instead of a lab coat. Ancient medicine was not a single system of errors waiting to be corrected. It was a living, evolving body of knowledge, shaped by the same fundamental force that shapes all knowledge. What actually happens when you try something? And sometimes, what happened was a patient who lived when they should have died. That result has always been worth paying attention to. For practices, for 1,000 years of accumulated observation, compressed into treatments that modern science eventually validated. History isn't just the past. Sometimes it's the answer we forgot we already had. If this changed how you think about ancient medicine, subscribe. There's plenty more where that came from.